Hey there, Golden Bears. I hope you're keeping it classy. Good to see you again. Today we're diving into the British West Indies. We also call it Barbados, and also those wonderful Bahama areas that some of you have been to travel to work on your tans and other part. And then also the South Atlantic colonies. I don't know why these nerds just can't call it what it is. We would call that South Carolina, which then formed into splitting to North Carolina. Okay, so it's called the British Barbados and the South Atlantic colonies. With that, I'd like to start with a story as usual, and the story goes all the way back to, oh golly, it must have been, about 10 or 11 years old. It was summertime, and you might have heard in other stories, but we live near a bunch of orange groves, and homes are being built around our area, and we thought, trees, new homes, that means extra lumber to go make what? A tree fort. So this is what me and a couple of my buddies did, and we spent days upon days. Our mothers were so happy. We're like, we were never home. And by the time we got the tree fort built with ladders kind of built into the tree and a platform and a few railings and like a little kind of faux roof on top, man, we felt like we were kings of our own land and dominion. It was cool. Well, as any king would do, you have to set up the ground rules, right? And so our ground rules were very, very simple. One, no girls. Sorry, I don't know if that would work in this day and age, but back in that time, no girls. Just didn't happen. Okay. Second thing is dogs only. No kitty cats. Nothing else was allowed up there. Just dogs. Okay. You say, how can dogs come up there? Hey, we were very resourceful. Dogs loved it. Third thing, this was the rule that we had of thumb. You can't be too big. You can't be too small. You just have to be in the middle. Now, when we came up with that, we didn't know what we were describing, but we did come up with this idea that you can't have anybody who thinks too high of themselves or too low and depressed of themselves, but just people who see themselves as normal. We just wanted normal people to come into our fort. And so as long as people could agree with that, woo, come on into the treehouse there in the orange groves down Bancroft Lane, and you were always welcome. Well, why do I tell you that story? Well, as we unpack this thing where the rice and the tobacco cultivation takes place, we're going to see a major introduction and growth of the enslavement movement from Africa. And with that comes along this ugly institution that are called the slave codes of Barbados. And soon South Carolina will adopt them, soon Virginia will adopt them. We might call them something by a different name, but essentially the Barbados slave codes. So I'll talk a little bit more about that either in this one or the next one, but just be mindful that they certainly weren't worried about people in the middle. Those Barbados slave codes were about everything to penalize and to crush and to make these slaves know that they were nothing more than chattel. That's a fancy word for a farm animal. So with that, there's a great quote here that the Mennonites church, Mennonites are not a break off, but part of the Quaker movement, which came out of the Wesleyan movement, and they're in Pennsylvania, which eventually we'll study on more in detail in the next time period. But we need to be mindful that not all colonies formed and developed the same, and specifically Pennsylvania. They were unique, and that they were very, very tolerant. And take a look at this. There is a saying that we should do all to men like as we will be done to ourselves, but to bring men hither or to rob and to sell them against their will, we stand against. Pray that what thing in the world can be done worse towards us than if men should rob or steal us away and sell us for slaves to stranger countries, separating husbands from their wives and children. It was not uncommon. Not only were slaves maybe hoping to escape, but predominantly there were a couple of Indian tribes, Savannah native tribes particularly, who were drove out by the South Carolina farmers, where they attempted to escape and go and live amongst the Mennonites, who gladly welcomed them. Well, our targets for today is to discuss these new staple crops, or cash crops we also have called them, or we're going to continue the examination of, we have tobacco, we have rice, we'll have indigo even that we can probably unpack in today. Talk about how slave labor becomes a new model, essentially because indentured servitude wasn't able to meet the demands that the Barbados and the West Indies required, or that of South Carolina, and how slavery shaped the life in the Carolinas as well. Remember your graphic organizer. This is key to be using this to keep track and monitor how each of these regions had unique characters and attributes in and of themselves. So we start with this map, and this map here, as you can see, has the West Indies in mind. And the West Indies aren't just controlled and dominated by one group. They initially were Spanish, predominantly through Spain, but Spain had overextended itself. They were covering most of Mexico and all the way up into the west of California and Nevada and Arizona as we know it. Look at all this to the south, and they have predominant areas there. And they were having such an extension, it was very difficult to manage this. And then having the loss of the Spanish Armada really weakened them as well. So what did this result in? Key opportunities for the British to move in and start swiping and taking away many of these islands that were there. The Dutch as well had an opportunity of coming in, but why couldn't the Dutch completely move in? Because the Spanish were busy trying to fight the Dutch to keep them somewhat under their roof and keep these islands, which now had become the crown of every king because of the wealth that these islands had created due to the sugar growth that they had. And so we need to be mindful that this area, the West Indies, isn't completely all British control, but we must recognize that it's the British that have the definite maritime advantage because of the advancements of their ships and having more of them than often the Spanish or the Dutch to make determining factors. The other thing I want to show you this map is how this Barbados region and soon some of these other islands here, notice the trip of 2,000 nautical islands to get to, as we call Charleston in today, or Charlestown, named after the king that came back into power, I think, in the 1660s after his father was beheaded not 20 years before, where this Carolinas had a very unique, I guess, symbiotic relationship where they both were needing one another. Carolinas needed the Barbados in order to send the money and the workers here to buy what? The goods, the foodstuffs that were needed to go back down here to Barbados. Why? Well, Barbados needed as much available land for sugar, not so much for anything else. And I'll try and talk about that here in a moment. So, number one, the English compete in the West Indies. And as I've shared with you already before, there were people there prior to them, but King Charles and many of his collaborators there in Parliament recognized, man, there is tremendous wealth to be had down there. And so they use their boats to obviously swoop in and take away from the French and the Spanish islands that were incredibly rich in capacity of growing things. What did they initially grow? Tobacco. That easy to grow 1 year crop that was easy to flourish in almost any kind of soil, and it would take very little time to cure, and then it can easily turn around and be sent off to Europe. Tobacco was the poor man's crop, and it took very little money or investment in order for it to find a great reward. Sugar, however, was quite the different story. Sugar required a tons amount of investment in order to expand the amount of land that you had, the amount of laborers you need, but more importantly, you needed to find ways in which to not only cut down the sugar cane and to process it into the liquid, and then you had to ship all that liquid in these big, I guess, our modern day equivalent of wine barrels, okay, the 55-gallon wine barrels I think they are, and ship them all the way up to the Netherlands. Why the Netherlands? Well, they had developed the most scientific and the most efficient means of producing sugar. That it was the highest quality there. And so it's very unique that here you had the British and the Dutch working together, creating this interesting symbiotic relationship, spurning Spain and kind of knocking them out of the entire situation there. So it's kind of a really cool 1-2 punch by the British and the Netherlands working together on this. But because of this transformation going from tobacco and the major decline in glut, I think in the 1650s and 1660s, because there was too much tobacco on the global scene, they looked elsewhere. And that elsewhere came in the form of sugar. Well, in order to grow this sugar and maintain this sugar and keep expanding this sugar, they needed slaves from Africa. Why from Africa? Well, one, they had the capacity to their DNA was able to withstand working in hotter, muggier, nastier climates that had bugs. What were their bodies capable of fighting off? Malaria. And I remember when I traveled to malaria, not only I have to get tons of shots in order to go, but I was drinking these beverages that had a little piece, had a little percentage of the soda in there of some quinquina, and I forget the name of this Q word in it, but it was quite tasty soda. But it was also there to make sure the mosquitoes weren't sitting there nibbling and passing along the West Nile or some sort of other malaria to you. That made them rather unique, the African people groups, and also quite valuable. And we'll see how the increasing the value goes when we get to Carolina and their ability to grow rice. But please know, because of this, drawing from away from tobacco and moving into sugarcane, we see a vast growth of needing of slaves to come from Africa to work in these fields along in areas of the West Indies. So what we'll soon discover is that, interestingly enough, just as the encomienda system along Cuba was the launch point for Columbus to move into the mainland, here you're going to find the West Indies is going to become the launch point of people going into the sugar fields here, but more importantly going into the Carolinas there. So this becomes the epicenter for the slave movement that will eventually feed into, as we know, of the slaves that are going to begin working along the south and the middle colonies of the English Empire. So here you see a simple, not a simple, but a rather ingenious design of how to extract the cane and turn it into a syrup. I'll talk more about this in class, but nothing was wasted. The sugar would be converted into this molasses type thing that would then be sent off to be refined into sugar as we know it. But the other less qualified or quality molasses could be turned into what? Rum, ho, 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 and a bottle of rum, whatever they sing there on the Disney ride there of the Pirates of the Caribbean. Rum became an amazing product that traveled well, was easy to store, and became a very profitable beverage, especially when we start talking about the next time period and how those rebellious colonists in New England and others used that alcohol to avoid paying taxes and amongst other things. So hold on to that and hold on to your britches until we get to there. Well, number two, the British West Indies influenced to South Carolina. Well, because of the calming of that firestorm of difficulty when Lord Oliver Cromwell had kicked out effectively Charles I, and he was beheaded, and then Cromwell had 10 years of running England, and then soon that was reunifying of England, and this reunification of England brought in Charles II. Charles II says, flat out, I'm going to give to my eight posse, my 8 people, land in this area called Carolinas. And it is there that, in honor of King George, they named a few towns after him, eventually down into Georgia that we'll talk about. But here they start this region called Charlestown, named after Charleston, okay? And it is here that this region is quite famous for some of you. If you've been watching that Netflix series, Pogues for Life, yo. This is the Outer Banks, and you're seeing visions of all over, wherever they trample and go in that episode, those series. That's all in and around Charleston and those parts of South Carolina. It's not taking place figuratively in Outer Banks. It is taking place in actually Charleston. So if you're interested in learning more about what Charleston is like and the beautiful around it, go see it. But how did that beauty get created? Well, simply is because this shift from tobacco to in the Barbados region to then to growing sugar. Well, in order to feed them, they needed rice. Where could that rice be grown? Well, they discovered that there was rice grown tremendously in parts of Africa. Well, because these business owners needed to feed their slaves in Barbados, they says, well, what if we import more slaves from the regions of rice-growing regions of Africa? They go for a premium price. Soon, the fields of South Carolina aren't really growing tobacco at all. They're growing predominantly rice to feed the people in Barbados and other vegetables, etc. So that's the relationship that I was talking about this. But the sad underbelly thing that we see in Charleston is that this becomes a major port where enslaved Africans are coming in the early 1700s. So Virginia was the first colony. If you remember, in 1619, we're going to begin seeing South Carolina and Charleston in the early 1700s becoming the epicenter, if you will, of the slave importation and distribution of them into other parts of South, eventually North Carolina, then into Richmond, Virginia, and then on into different parts of the colonies as it expands. Well, number 3 here is this daily life of the 18th century South Carolina. We need to be mindful that, sadly, the rich get richer and the poor get the picture. That's what I like to call it here. With much of the good land being gobbled up by who? The 8 people that the king had placed in charge of the Carolinas, and then they gave other land or sold land to their cronies and their friends. Soon all the good land was only in the hand of the wealthy planters. And then the merchants became wealthy because they're the only ones that had the boats to be able to haul back and forth the sugar or the rice. So both of these had a very strong hold on the market prices. They determined the laws. They set the terms of how families had lived. Doesn't matter if you're a free black or if you were a white family that came as an indentured servant, or maybe you had came as a Scots Irishman, and because the king basically kicked you out for leading a revolt against the king, trying to fight for their freedom up in Scotland and Ireland, they were all forced to move into these regions. And in order to make a living, they had to scratch by. How? They were often just farming and living on the land that were owned by the wealthy landowners. And if they had a side little plot, maybe so, but they began looking to be creating other cash crops, and that's where indigo was discovered, this taro-like crop that when processed created a purple-like hue that became quite famous and quite valued in the European circles for the color of its purplish blue hue that could be used to stain the various clothing there. What did this do? It created, sadly, a small number of very wealthy aristocrats there in South Carolina, who we will discover in subsequent lessons here that they're going to be like this to people in North Carolina. Why? North Carolina is just seen as just the backwater woods, Scots-Irish people, the Germans, these rebellious people who were sent over by the king. Heck, they didn't have a port that was worthwhile of anything to do trade. So these people had to live up in the highlands with no real coastal access and figured out how to make a living. To the north of them was Virginia, who had been established some 120 years before approximately, and they were well established and good, but and often saw themselves as the lofty, gifted, wealthy aristocrats of Virginia. After all, they were the first to come here. And then now you have the wealthy aristocrats who were appointed by Charles II to take over Carolina. Who's in the middle of that? Poor backwater North Carolinians that just, don't have a place to belong of sorts in this situation. So they become the subsistence farmers that you can see here, and this ties them to the land and becomes, this is going to set us up soon for some frustration points between the white Southerners and those of the black farmers who might have freedom, but it's also going to create a definite frustration point with the colonial leaders who aren't listening to some of their pleas, okay, or their frustrations from this. That's what we would call the Bacon Rebellion. Will stem from that, and I'm going to talk about a few other rebellions that happened to this point. So with that, I'd like to conclude recognizing that the West Indies is essentially the same thing as Barbados. And if you remember, tobacco is the poor man's crop, where sugar is for only the wealthy. And the wealthy were the only ones that were able to develop the capacity to grow it, to raise it, to harvest it, and by buying the slaves, and to send it off and ship it off and have the means to do that, all the way up to the Netherlands for distribution to the rest of the globe. And so be mindful that Carolina and Barbados and those West Indies have a very strong symbiotic relationship that is eventually going to continue that ugly root of enslaved people groups coming to the American shores that will then spread outward here and in subsequent time period. So with that, Golden Bears, keep it classy as I know you do, and we'll see you in our next lecture.